Welcome, everyone, to Potholes and Politics, the long-delayed episode. Highly anticipated, anxiously awaited, long overdue for the long-suffering crew. Here with you today are your co-hosts. I'm Rebecca Graham, also known as Grambo.
And I'm Rebecca Lambert, also known as Lambo.
And I am Amanda Campbell, also known as Cambo.
Woohoo!
The dynamic
ladies,
trio.
We have been busy on the tour of the state's vast different regions, holding regional meetings with municipal officials, county officials, state partners, and candidates for the legislature all over the state. And I think we have now completed, what was our 9th the other night, with 4 more on tap and a lot of requests to continue doing this with not a lot of capacity to do it, but nothing prevents regional meetings from happening with those regional partners in future. Just maybe a lift that we're not going to be able to sustain, particularly because we are about to enter our legislative session.
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, dun, dun. I was just going to do that.
So we started
even though
off.
We've been at all these different locations all over the state, the messaging is very similar.
There is a lot of similarities, but also a lot of difference I found in both understanding of some of those pressures, capacity to address some of those pressures, and even some solutions that were presented that might be achievable. We started off in September in Lincoln County with a Sagadahoc-Lincoln County team focus. And then that same week, we went to Knox and Waldo and did a combined meeting. And those two were very different, but the Mid-Coast in general had some very common pressures, particularly around housing and also public safety. Do you, thinking back to those, September feels like decades ago, but really wasn't that long ago. Just feels like we've done a lot of work since. Amanda, these are home counties for us. So were there any interesting takeaways for you?
The biggest takeaway, I think, just in general, I was pleasantly surprised that candidates actually showed up. I didn't really anticipate that they would want to participate in something like this. So it was nice to have that. And we've had candidates at every session. The local ones to us, the Sag County, Lincoln County one, again, was the first one. And it was interesting to hear the back and forth between the candidates that were there and the municipal representatives that were there. It was nice to be able to see productive dialogue happening, and not necessarily around anything specific, but that's just been one of my key takeaways, that it seems like it's been more positive than I anticipated it would be.
Yeah, the tone is definitely different outside of session, I think, with our elected representatives than it is during session. And as we know, we're not exactly pleasant to be around either when we're drinking from a fire hose, and as are they. I think one of the interesting things that came out of those two were the differences between what was looming for them, but the detail in which some of the folks at the municipal level understood legislation that had passed and some of the needs, particularly around the senior stabilization program, and being able to articulate that to candidates that didn't necessarily have that background, didn't understand what happened with that, why the state didn't want to continue with that, and its then effect upon their residents. So one of the first solutions that we heard from a municipal official is to up and increase that return that seniors that are means tested can receive through the filing of their income taxes annually, which is one of those programs that is a challenge because most of the people that qualify for that are not required to file taxes. And it wasn't until COVID and that requirement for some of those reimbursements where they started getting used to filing taxes, even though they knew that they weren't going to have to pay anything. It enabled them to receive direct payments from the government for those programs. And that's the same thing with the senior property tax circuit breaker program. I'm not sure what the official name is. I remember it used to be like the circuit breaker, but it doesn't only apply to seniors. There's just a greater level that applies to seniors. It also applies to families and individuals that are paying a larger portion of their rent. That's something that through their filing of main taxes, they receive credit for. And in the cases of someone who doesn't need to file, they can get a direct payment for up to, I believe it's $2,000 of what they pay in property taxes back based upon those means testings, which can't happen at the municipal level. That has to happen at a main revenue service level. That's a skill set and a whole bunch of formulas that municipal officials don't have handy.
And that property tax fairness credit is what they expanded.
Right.
And then also the main revenue and the state were really pushing municipalities to educate the residents on the deferral program as well at the state level in exchange for doing away with and repealing the stabilization program that just couldn't be funded. It was just great idea and concept, but
the program was the exchange for that. The education piece is something that municipalities, I think, are feeling compelled to do, but they are that education piece wasn't their obligation necessarily.
No, of course not.
To do that. But it is of avail to seniors through a number of different programs. Usually there are like Senior Spectrum and, for example, those types of programs that do a lot of senior events in counties. They're often able to also work through that tax and filing of taxes for free for seniors as well. Yep. But one of the other pieces that one of the assessors brought up was the need to increase the homestead exemption up to, he was suggesting $75,000, which would make a real difference for individuals who have seen an inflation in the value of their property that is through no fault of their own, but simply existing in a location during an insane market grab for the properties around them. It would mean some real tax relief, $75,000 off their assessed value, which I believe is provided back to the community at a specific rate. Or what are we at currently? Because I know that there were two programs that...
The homestead is 76% reimbursement, but it's also driven by your ratio.
Your assessment ratio.
Correct. So you get 76% of your, if you are at the 100% ratio.
And the individual, if you're at the 100% ratio, actually gets the full value of their homestead in that exemption.
Correct.
Which they don't get if you don't assess at the 100% of the value that the state decides is the valuation for your community.
Correct.
So that's also a challenge, but it would be a uniform way of increasing the benefit for permanent residents and folks on fixed income with lower property values, and then folks that have come in and paid astronomical prices and have higher property values. They would still receive the same benefit, but it's going to mean less of an impact on their tax assessment.
In other words, it would impact the people who it was intended to impact rather than everybody across the board.
100% of everyone across the board that claims that they are permanent residents would get that benefit, but it would work itself out so that the individual in a mobile home, for instance, might not have any property tax because they might not, their assessed value might not meet that $75,000 threshold, but the person in the same neighborhood who has an oceanfront property and paid $1.2 million would also receive that, but it means less to their tax assessment than it would necessarily to. So it has a bigger impact proportion.
The people it doesn't help are those long timers who have that oceanfront smaller home that's been in their families for generations and through no fault of their own in the market has increased exponentially in value and increased their taxes again through no fault of their own. And yeah, anything is going to help. But just because their house is valued as much as the mansion next door doesn't mean that they can afford the taxes as easily as the neighbor next door.
Yeah. And that's why property tax and relying on property tax to deliver the vast majority of government services in the state is a really regressive and painful way to be funding things that the state cares about. I know that there's usually a breakdown as to how much of that comes from sales and income tax and how much of it comes from property tax.
So I've been doing lots of financial review. I've just finished inputting all of the 2022 town audit financial information into a really big spreadsheet. That was part of a transfer in how we collect our fiscal data, just because municipalities are so overwhelmed that they either can't or don't or whatever with any sort of surveys that we send out. And so I've been extrapolating that info myself from audits that get sent into the state auditor office. So now I'm starting to compare those numbers, and I don't have any solid data yet, but I think it's going to be very interesting to see how those 3 feet of the stool are represented when we have some good numbers. I do have state numbers for 2022. So once I've got all of those columns organized and buttons clicked, we'll have some really good information to see how that property tax number compares to other funding that's coming.
Rebecca, what about you? What do you remember about those ones?
I remember that there were lots of current legislators and lots of candidates. Particularly, there were county commissioner candidates that were there. And I thought that was really interesting. Like I said at the beginning, I think there were a lot of talk about EMS services and public safety, housing, as you mentioned. Education was brought up as well. And as we all know, and we've been saying, the Maine Education Policy Research Institute is doing a deep dive on the EPS funding formula. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that study plays out and if municipalities could see any benefit from any kind of adjustments that would be made or recommended.
Yeah, the EPS formula doesn't count special education funding as an essential service in that calculation, but we all know that is on a statewide level, and it falls to the municipality, who really doesn't have any control over the needs of students in terms of their special education needs. And I know that one of the things that's happened with the increased valuation assessments that the state has done on all communities is that a number of communities who were receiving revenue sharing too and support for their schools are now minimum receivers. And suddenly their school bill has blown up. We've heard that pretty much across the board. And the valuation may have blown up, but the ability for those people in that community to pay, or the needs of that community, certainly hasn't blown up.
That is true. And there's a lot of evaluation done with that school lunch number, like the low income numbers, that now that school lunch is free, a lot of people aren't filling out those forms. So I don't think that's a really good model for the income level of those towns.
Yeah.
Since COVID, things have changed so much that I think everything just needs to be reevaluated.
One of the things that I remember really starkly about those free and reduced lunch programs and those forms was that you could see in the younger groups, so like K through 5 or 6, they were being filled out by parents and sent back. And then in some communities, at least one community near me, over 75% of the school population qualified. And then suddenly that dropped off to nothing, or 20% in high school. And it's not that suddenly those same kids got wealthy and no longer qualified. It's that the forms aren't coming back in. The kids maybe aren't bringing them home, but there's also a stigma, or was a stigma, that was associated with receiving those, because they oftentimes are different meals and there was a way of getting called out. So I think that the benefit of having that free lunch is reducing the stigma entirely and getting the food to the kids that we know need it, depending upon those numbers. We still haven't reduced the stigma if you're using a measure that we really were trying to break away from. So,
right.
What do you think?
That's even just despite the schools trying to educate parents and say, even if you don't qualify, fill it out for us, because we need the data in order to receive the funding. And I'm not sure that even that helped bring those numbers back up especially for the older population of students.
I'm wondering if there isn't a different way to approach that, like through MRS. I would think that they would have a per capita number, knowing how the residents have filed their taxes. They would,
if they have dependents.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That it's tied to the dependents, and obviously their income level would be known to as a result of that. So it would remove the need for them to do one more thing in order to get something to benefit the entire community, and just use existing data.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's an interesting concept too.
Yeah,
and you wouldn't even need people, just geographic data that who are in this school district, if they're regionalized school districts.
Yeah, 100%. Because who's underneath, who's a dependent age, and there will be complexities that obviously aren't even reported on that free fund that could be captured in that way. But
that's interesting.
It's a one and done, so that the need is pretty obvious. And
And you would think along those same lines that there have to be how many other programs out there related to how many other areas of need that could be solved in the same kind of way.
Yeah, I'm sure MRS will love that.
It's
Let's
a
suggest it.
full-time job.
Let's suggest it. Let's suggest it.
We'll just solve all the problems, the three of us.
So some of the areas that we've been to more recently have been in rural northern areas. So we were in Somerset, and then we were also in Millinocket and in Bangor. Bangor's not really rural, but similar issues. And I think one of the things we also heard around the realm of public safety was around how county jails are funded and what has happened with the state contributions to the operations of county jails and what pressures are in those facilities that are well beyond any ability to locally address or solve those problems, yet a tremendous amount of local resources are being required to address what is the triage of last resort, basically.
Yeah, that has been very interesting and helpful for me to hear the differences between jails and prisons. And I didn't know that distinction actually until I went to these regional meetings. I just figured they're jails and prisons are one and the same, but clearly they are different. And the jails seem to be taking a brunt of the medical assisted treatment because they come to them in their most vulnerable form before they get convicted and hit the prison.
Yeah, and that pre-conviction thing is also holding up a lot of facilities. So we heard in Penobscot that 90% of the folks that are committed and currently in that facility are too high risk to be in the community and released on pretrial detention in the community and have a lot of co-occurring disorders, but also have been languishing there for quite some time because the judiciary is backed up. So they're not even convicted or sentenced yet.
Just waiting for their trial.
Yeah. And of course, they have a whole bunch of needs in there. And the other startling thing was the use of DHHS to commit individuals to these facilities because there are no forensic beds for mental health. So you have folks that are a significant public safety risk, either to themselves or others, and need a secured confinement, but there are no mental health beds for them that are available. And therefore, the county jail becomes that space, and the county's operations are funded by property tax. So the lack of state investment in those resources that are so desperately needed has really put a burden on kind of a really bad situation for those individuals to be in the county jail as well.
Nor are they trained to deal with the type of mental health issues that are coming to them.
Yeah.
And you have to wonder how many of those folks who are there on pretrial or even who get convicted may not have committed a crime in the first place had they had the appropriate level of mental health care in the first place. It's just this whole discussion, this whole discussion has been really eye-opening for me. This is the one area where I have learned the most personally during our forums. And the county tax bill would come and we'd pay it when it was time. We'd take the 60 days to pay it and walk in and hand them a check on Friday afternoon so they couldn't cash it until Monday morning.
But someone in Bangor mentioned that they wait until the day and they're thinking about sending it in pennies. But
yeah, we did that every year. One year it was actually on Halloween, and my treasurer and I went to the county and paid it in costume. But it's the thought process behind what is it exactly that the counties do beyond jail and public safety that is resulting in these astronomical county tax bills that are coming to the municipalities, when in some cases they're paying for services that they're providing themselves. And a lot of times we don't have much, if any, say over the county budgeting process. So this has been very interesting for me. So I've appreciated this conversation a lot.
I think what was also startling for me to hear was in Presque Isle, where the police chief was talking about the burden that poses on his staff, where they know that they have someone that they have 300 calls with. They can watch this decline of the individual, knowing that they need services that are not available anywhere in Aroostook. They've got first line, they can deal with triage in that moment, but basically they're just constantly going to the same place, waiting for that person to commit a crime so that they can get them into the county facility, county jail, and they'll get some treatment, but not that necessarily the mental health treatment that they need to be having. And recently, the legislature has required county jails to provide that, but they never provided the funding for that. So they're often done by a vendor who's also doing their medical care in that facility. To what level they're even equipped to be able to handle individuals that are in that state of crisis and long term. They can't force medication on them because they're not in a hospital setting. And that's one thing that a lot of folks need to be stabilized. But because there's not in an inpatient bed or behavioral bed, they're not getting the specialized services that they need. And arguably, if you are, we know we've heard pretty resoundingly that the folks that are in county jails are not individuals that existed the way they used to be. They're not folks that have stolen cars or written bad checks or even committed an OUI. These are folks that are in there for a really complex, high level, and often violent reason, probably associated with that decline in mental health as well. But they've got a lot of needs that really can't, if you're paying for their care of last resort, I don't know how you use that. And that's one of the things I focus on as the agency. Like, how would a community decide to address the deficit in those supports? Do they have agency to build a statewide system for mental health that is forensic beds and inpatient beds and behavioral health that meets parents and students in that location to get them? That's something you can't build on a local level, nor would you want that to not be available at the place of need. So I don't know. You can do that through property tax.
From what we've heard, mental health resources north of pretty much Augusta basically are non-existent. You can't get any resources. And so that whole half of the state is just languishing.
North, west, and east, because in coastal areas, they don't have it either. And in mountain areas, they don't have it either. It's really much the I-95 corridor, and it stops at Bangor.
And that was something that was never actually said in words, but that you could take away from the conversations in those places like Skowhegan and Presque Isle and even Waldo County to some extent, that those municipal officials really feel distanced from the world, really, because they are so rural and because their services are so limited, not for lack of their own resources, but just because there's, the volunteerism is down. The population is aging. They don't feel like they're being heard by the state. And that really I don't think that would be the same conversation in a Freeport or York County or even Northern Cumberland County, even here in the Bath Brunswick area. But some of these places that we've been to, those people feel it's obviously that they don't feel like they're getting the services that they need from the state. And then as a result, can't provide the services that their communities need.
Yeah, that was also interesting to me when we were in Waldo County. There was 0 treatment facilities there. The county jail is the location that someone who's in a crisis that is a danger to themselves or others is going to end up into at some cycle. And the impact that has on the folks that have to deal with them on a regular basis to watch it decline to get to that point, and not really with the tools, which I think law enforcement is used to having tools to stop behavior. And there is no tool to deal with this. You can deal with a crisis in the moment, but when people need that ongoing care, they've got great triage, local crisis response, but when you need that ongoing, elevated next level, it's non-existent. I think we heard that with some housing programs too, which I thought were really interesting in discussion in Waldo, but also in discussion with Kathleen Billings in Stonington, who was in the middle of a county meeting that night, but understanding how that rise in assessed value really impacts those residents. And basically they don't have the ability to compete for those programs for affordable housing, but they have severe need and severe limits on their geography. They're not going to grow land on a peninsula. So they're not also going to have a sewer system and a water department in the way that Portland or South Portland could have. And so the programs that are targeting that are really focused on having things like transportation and infrastructure, but yet the need for affordable housing is really acute and really profound in those areas where they don't have those resources. And so they've got to compete for this small rural pool that's pretty much gone the moment that it drops because everybody wants it. For that same reason, there's a more of a rural need in the vast state that has 486 other municipalities than in where we know everyone wants to live, like in the city.
Interesting, on the news recently, all of these potential affordable housing projects being blocked by local residents, and the ones that qualify for this money that you're talking about, that the folks in rural Maine, because of their, or coastal rural Maine, because of their valuations, don't qualify for, but they want the housing. They want the housing. Can't get the supports they need to get it. And meanwhile, you've got folks in other parts of the state who are willing to build it and have the resources and capacity to do, and the communities are saying no.
Yeah. Part of the reason why developers are targeting those areas is because they are going to make more money than they are going to in providing housing in another location. So that profit motive is something that nobody really talks about openly. No one's building any house unless they're making money off it. They're not doing it to break even. So one of the proposals that I heard that I know that would not be uniformly welcomed was trying to get a program to maybe build a municipally owned mobile home park, because mobile homes are something that someone can own and can grow in value, but also don't need to be living necessarily right on top of somebody else. You can have a yard, you can grow your own food, you can have a place for your kids to play in a neighborhood that you wouldn't necessarily in a really dense block of apartments in a shared setting. So they are attractive for folks that can see asset value increase in that. We know they're targeted by corporations as they are selling and moving away from family ownership to kind of corporate ownership of these trailer parks underneath, because the land is rented and the land's value grows, even if the building's value doesn't grow. I think one of our town managers was like, why can't we get programs, or why can't those programs actually look at creating those places? Because that's something that you could build a large septic system and kind of mini public water system for. It would provide a lot of housing that would really bring residents of mixed, whether it's senior or families, and allow them to have a workforce to actually deal with their annual tourist onslaught. Some folks feel the same way around that, but I think if you look at the changes in how manufactured homes are constructed and built, that a lot of the stigma around them can be argued away pretty easily too. So 95 units in Stonington might not make sense in a big, huge tower block. Maybe a 40-lot
Mobile home park
would
makes sense,
and might help a lot of folks that are local residents stay in those communities. A lot of older people in rural and coastal areas are really faced with those transports and those limitations, but they own their homes and they also like that stability of being in those homes. And that doesn't mean that they have access to the social supports and healthcare that they need, but there's a lot of emotional connection to place that I think doesn't get valued as much in these conversations. And folks appreciate the value of looking at the trees that they've grown around them. Hopefully we can have conversations that are a little more holistic next year. Most recently, just this week, we went to Millinocket.
Yes, we did.
That was an interesting conversation around EMS.
It was. The biggest thing I learned in that conversation is that they have an older population. A lot of their calls are non-transport calls, which they can't bill for. And their EMS service is struggling right now to stay afloat, as is the surrounding towns. We heard from Brownville too, who were there, and Patton.
And we were in East Millinocket, and they were struggling as well and looking at how to assess the provisions that they provide in adjacent communities. So they provide ambulance service for Sherman, which is quite a distance. And I think that region is also hit with the unorganized territory. So they have to provide for the unorganized territory. So it might be 7 or 8 miles in one direction that the ambulance has to go, or more, before it can reach its location. And then 7 or 8 miles back, which takes it out of service for the rest of the community. But to actually adequately staff for that is an extreme expense, yet it's the end of the line. There's nobody that they could fall back on. So they recognize that there is that cost. And I think Patton was the one that actually created an apartment space. They're renting
I was just going to say that. Yeah. I was
Yeah.
just remembering they bought an apartment so that their crew could be within 5 minutes of the bay, the ambulance bay.
because it's not like they have local paramedics, but they were also having issues with training. And that's something that I hadn't heard in other areas. And they were having issues with getting folks trained to that certain level.
They wanted to keep it local. And they have the space, the satellite office.
So it's the Katahdin Higher Education Center, which is UMA has a satellite campus there and satellite programs.
Is it the
CC
economic
does too.
development office as well?
I think it is. It's really a central hub, and they were getting ready to launch their a much new and improved, quite lovely section that was childcare.
Oh, yeah.
Associated with that.
Beautiful outdoor playground. They were doing the ribbon cutting the next day. Susan Collins was coming.
Yeah, that was really great to see, and to talk to Deb, the senator director, and understand how passionate she was around that. And really, it really is the hub of that region in terms of being able to be a place where folks can learn and grow, literally.
Yeah,
But they don't have a paramedic program, the necessary folks to teach that program that are very close to that center. I think the closest that they were able to go is Bangor, which is over an hour away. And then when they were offering the program, because you have to have a high level of credentials in paramedicine to be able to administer the program that allows you to pass the national test. Maine has switched from what was a Maine certification for that to a national test. And one of the bigger issues around the national test, it's great, you can work in ambulance anywhere, but one of the issues is that it also covers a lot of procedures that aren't encountered. Like there are a lot of things that wouldn't necessarily apply, but you still need to know it in order to pass that test. So it also requires a paramedic of a higher standard and level to teach it. And those are been hard to find. So the availability of one, I believe the last class they said was during the day, which makes it really hard for volunteer communities like that.
Right.
And folks who have jobs in other areas to do their public service in that way. So,
right. Because most of the people who are serving in those roles are for volunteer type roles.
Yeah.
And they have full-time jobs that they can't leave just to go to their training.
yeah, which is, it's pretty intense and it takes a long time. But also driving an hour after you've worked all day to take a class is a struggle. People are doing it. I think that was the other key thing, that they're finding people to do it. But if they don't offer it in the evening hours, that's a challenge. So I think Deb was committed to trying to figure out how to bring that closer to the Millinocket area. And allow
She's
people-
always working on something.
I know.
That was her next
She
project.
struck me as just so municipal. I don't think she realizes it, but bootstrapping.
Yeah.
Let's figure out how to get it done. There's a need. Let's figure out how to get it done.
And the ideas that have come about, the community policing and community paramedicine programs, I thought were great ideas. I don't know if that's something that you can explain a little better than I could, but those are great ideas that I think could really benefit the rural patrol issue that's been brought up at a lot of these forums.
Yeah, the Maine Community Policing Institute, our friend Noel March has been helping us set up a lot of these meetings as well. And he offers a micro certificate that's supported by the Alfond Center, the Alfond Workforce Development Funds that have been reallocated or reauthorized as well. But it would allow a lot of smaller departments to maximize their training resources and support getting a micro certificate for an officer with a focus on community policing. And I think that program does a couple of things. One is it provides a professional credential that's sellable for an officer, but it also provides an opportunity for them to expose to actually think about even more education. I think there's a significant number of the vast majority of law enforcement has a higher education, either associates or bachelor's degree. Last time I did a survey. So there's been this misconception that they don't, but most of them do. And many of them are continuing education as they are working. So sometimes the communities are providing funds for that as part of their training dollars, but the Maine Community Policing Institute is also providing like a certification for an entire department if they provide opportunity and maybe use some of those training funds to pick up what is the other half of the cost. So half of the costs of that program are paid for by the Alfred Center, and the other half are received at a reduced rate for MMA members, but also it's a much smaller cost for the student that's going there. And that includes all the books and stuff in that grant. So it's a real benefit and can jumpstart someone to getting a higher degree if they so choose as well.
And then is there a program at that level as well for the paramedicine, or is that a state license for the EMS responding department?
The community paramedicine program, from what I understand, is created to fill a backstop gap between home health supports and discharge from a hospital, particularly for older folks, but folks that actually might need some low-level care that ambulance services do all the time, but isn't billable for them unless they put them in the bus and take them someplace else, which is insane. So if you received that care in a doctor's office, like wound changing dressing, that care would not be billable if it were conducted by a paramedic. So a lot of folks are held up too in the facility until they can have some notification that home supports are going to be there to help them with that transition. And often those people are equally hard to find. So older folks, if no one shows up, if they have a home health person and doesn't show up, but they need a catheter change or they need their bandage changed or medicine administered or that type of thing, they call the ambulance anyway. So the community paramedicine program actually would allow it to be billable, and it creates a relationship. So the person that's doing that type of programming is working underneath the med control doctor. So it's working under their license.
A mobile healthcare type.
Yeah, in a really different way, but through the existing ambulance. It is, I think, a challenge for billing and that type of material, but I think there's also a certification piece there too. Again,
I just think that would be such a great service.
It is. There's a pilot program, I think, that's going on right now. And I think the problems around the billing are what are most a challenge for all of those facilities. So I think one of our platform ideas that's been floated is making sure that we get that care on scene reimbursed, because it would be reimbursed in any other situation inside of a facility and therefore should be reimbursed and help make ambulance services whole so that the cost of running them is somehow picked up at a greater, or at least covered in a greater way.
Mm.
So many individuals, when faced with an ambulance ride someplace, really would rather not if they had the choice, because they know that it's going to be expensive afterwards and that they might be getting billed for that.
I had made a note to look up community paramedicine in other states. And I did that, and I saw that in 2012, a pilot program was passed for Maine, but it was never funded.
Yeah.
And it was just left to the communities to figure out how to get it up and running and pay for it, which I thought was interesting.
The barriers that we place in front of individuals, I don't know how to measure whether or not it's proportional, but I think there are some things that are no-brainers, and I get why they exist, but sometimes they have the opposite impact, and we're seeing that pretty starkly now. We're also seeing pretty starkly that strong sense of community and how people live in that community and how they are supported is largely through volunteerism and local agencies and local community resources that are stood up by individuals who really care about that. So there's vacuums that are created when those go away or you don't have volunteers. And yet they provide that really important role. I don't think it's a conundrum that Maine feels alone. I just think we have such a vast geography that it stands out really profoundly. Lots of folks were talking about regionalizing to provide, in some ways, stable employment, because the part-time employment for multiple communities doesn't necessarily attract people that want to do that. You don't have benefits. So we heard some COGs are doing things like applying for grants to see if they can hire a regional code enforcement officer that would help communities and provide a full-time level of employment and hopefully stability for someone who wanted to do that for multiple communities. I think we heard battered around a similar approach or desire for a similar approach to animal control and assessing. These are all positions that are often or have been historically provided on a part-time basis within communities that are part-time.
I even spoke to someone after our trip to Hancock County about a very small plantation who can't find a treasurer. We need someone to come do our books one day a week. And I said, talk to the COG, tell them, and even if they can't find it, talk to your other communities. Who else is in the same boat that you're in? Who can you all share someone to come one day a week to provide that full-time position for someone who's willing to travel to those different communities? So it was just interesting that it isn't just our service hubs that are the service positions like CEO, ACO that are struggling. It's those basics. You got to have somebody to do your books.
Yeah.
And that's a struggle.
Plantation may not be able to afford to have a manager or a full-time person come in to do all that.
That's what this gentleman was saying. We have a population of 60 people here. I'm one of 3 selectmen. I'm retired. I get paid nothing. I don't know how to do any of this. I love my community. But you've got the same 7 people doing all of the jobs. And it's a real struggle, especially as, again, that population ages or just wants to do something else because they've been on the select board for 30 years. It's
Yeah, I don't know how you grow public service or a belief and faith and desire for public service. I sometimes think we were a messed up generation.
Don't want to be on your town's budget committee. Come on.
Deep as unfinished. Of course, everyone hates you. Why would you not want that?
I remember when I first started working at the town office that it all of a sudden hit me like a ton of bricks. And I said to all of my son's parents that we're all within a 5 or 6 year span, we have to learn how to take care of this town, because if we don't, we're going to inherit it and none of us are going to know what to do. And that is slowly starting to happen.
One of the things that we know, because we have some folks on our LPC that are providing services for adjacent communities, they're overwhelmed.
Absolutely.
As well. So it's great, but there often isn't someone that has that capacity locally. And we're finding that even at the state level with auditors. So getting audited financials for a municipality is a huge problem because there are no auditors that want to do government audits, because it's probably nowhere near as lucrative as doing corporate audits.
And all the people who did do them are either retired or dying.
Right.
And now you even have the people who are still left to do the audits, cherry picking which communities are the most lucrative for their firms to do. And when you're told by the auditor who's done your audits for 100 years that all of a sudden your community is too small to make them any money, where does that leave you?
Yeah. Pretty much if there's money to be made in government, then it isn't a job or a task that is done by government. It is done by someone else. And that's, next week, we're going to be in Machias. One of the communities there reached out. He had signed up initially, and he told me that they were actually having their annual town meeting that day because they had been waiting for their audited financials for so long. So they had to move it out. So they're having their town meeting on that day, which is the week of the election as well. And I was just like, whoa, your clerk is a hero. Holy cow. Can't even imagine doing that.
I think you're going to be solo for that one, Rebecca.
Yeah, story of my life. One wants to come party with me in Machias?
Wiscasset that night.
Yes, you're going to be doing a speed dating. Oh,
Speed
no, I guess
networking. I'm not dating. I'm a married woman.
It's not speed dating. It's speed networking. I think speed dating of municipal officials. Speed networking of municipal officials.
That's correct.
Yeah. I won't be in Lincoln County, so I'm expecting you to be the good Rebecca in Lincoln County.
I will be. I'll leave
while
that
I'm in
bad
Washington
Rebecca to
County. And I will be the bad Rebecca in Washington. Anything else around those meetings?
I think they were a great idea. I think people really appreciated having that opportunity, which we've seen in the comments saying we should do this more often. Or like I've seen in the phone calls that have been reaching out after each one. Huge uptick for me anyway, for member engagement, people calling about trash, people calling about all sorts of topics that we've discussed, taxes, etc., as a result of these meetings. So clearly was a great idea. So kudos to you, Grambo, for that. I think anytime we can do something that helps educate our members and ourselves, I've learned a ton during these.
Yeah.
I think it's great. It's been a lot of fun to be a part of.
Thank you for that. I think the initial vision was that we would be educating a lot of the candidates around municipal issues. I think that's happened. I don't necessarily have any feedback for that, but I think what we have done is build relationships, build new relationships, but also bridge some of the collective local government pressures. And rather than historically pointing fingers at different levels of government, we've taken an opportunity to build those relationships and to actually tell those stories so that everyone knows that it's not just county law enforcement, because state police have never had an increase in their complement in 30 years going up because of that and the need to hire more deputies. It's actually county jails. It's the cost of county jails and the reduction of state funds that have been dedicated to that task over time, and the exponential growth of the need to address complex situations and realities within those facilities that are driving up a lot of those assessments. And focusing on what's biggest, we often focus on symptoms, I think. And I think that maybe state policy benefits when we focus on symptoms and don't focus on problems, because often you can, as you've sat through and gone through those study groups, everyone knows what the problem is and nobody wants to implement it, but we'll walk around it. We'll take little bites around it because that doesn't require us to pay for anything or to tax in a different way. That would be too much. So I think those conversations and focusing on what the real problems are have been really beneficial for our members that have attended too, because they didn't really understand what was going on within county jails. And I've heard pretty consistently that was a big productive conversation, but also just figuring out where we can align.
I think it was productive for all three levels. I think refreshing to see how open people were to talking and sharing their ideas and the problems that they have and solutions for those problems. And it was nice to see legislators and candidates for the legislature that would come and were not just campaigning. They were open-minded and listening and asking questions. So, that was refreshing. I'm encouraged for this next legislative session.
Yeah, there was one that we did that had only a single municipal official, but we spent a lot of time with some candidates who were really knowledgeable candidates and really talking through what regional services needed as well, because we've been working with our regional partners where they exist to talk about their pressures, because they're providing important services. And it's also important for our members to know that those services are out there and where they can get them. So we were able to connect like sewer districts in Waldo that are small sewer districts to how they can access the funds for resiliency that might be available for them to address some of the climate impacts through the regional planning partners there in Mid-Coast Council of Governments. Those were great opportunities to have those conversations, and also have conversations with our elected officials, presuming that they get elected previously, to go back over how things got to the place that they were and where we need support going forward. And some of that also allows us to engage our LPC members a lot better. And in some places they were really great and showed up, and we know that we'll be able to rely on them to beat the drum when those folks go home, to say, hey, but hopefully establish relationships between them and their local representatives and candidates for office, so that they know they've heard from Elaine what is going on in Solon and what is most important for her and what she might need. And they might think about that when they are in the State House. So in some places, those relationships, I think, were strengthened and renewed. And I think it was good all around. And I just learned so much and liked meeting a broader group of municipal officials. It's a lot of work that I'm really grateful I have you guys to help lift.
Learned a lot about how to do it a subsequent time and all that stuff. You got to expect some of those bumps in the road the first time you deploy something new.
Yes, and we've been pivoting since, but I also think that we're going to have more FaceTime at the State House, definitely. But I really loved having these in-community conversations led by municipal folks and talking about their issues in a meaningful way to hear what they thought. Because I learned a lot in that as well. And I would love to do, if I could just spend all of next session just meeting with municipal officials and candidates in their communities, I'd probably be a happier advocate. There we are then.
There we are then.
Your task for this weekend, should you choose to accept it, is to try to find that old Maine song about biscuits and gravy with butter and tough Maine women. If anybody knows who's listening, please email the podcast at mmapodcast@memun.org.
Thank you. You'll prevent us from going crazy.
No, that already happened.